So before I go into any of the projects I've been working on and just kind of going over like what I've been doing over the past like year and a half, who this channel is for, I just basically want to go over my background and why I even made this channel in the first place, right? So I learned to code like all the way back in 2020. My first language was Rust, and the reason why I wanted to learn Rust was because I wanted to do blockchain development, specifically on like the Polkadot ecosystem, right? And I did that for a couple months. I wasn't specifically working at the Parity Foundations at that company, but basically, doing like small things like helping out with bugs, just doing, small things here and there. And then when I first got into like dealing with AI and LLMs and seeing what it was all about, this was about 2023, right? And I started out using Gemini, I think it was like Gemini 2.5. Like it was just like the really, really early days when models were really just starting to get out into the public. And this was like back when if you were to try to build a program of like, let's say, 2 to 300 lines of code and have that code, actually compile, run properly, like it was pretty much impossible, right? The models were just not capable of doing that. It was just way out of bounds for what you would expect from those LLMs. And if you were to try to use it in like a business sense, like you want to build like an app or anything like that, and have it actually run, and be coherent and actually again be useful, you would have to spend so much time like debugging and dealing with issues that you were just better off doing it, on your own. Nowadays, even with the drawbacks of LLMs, you can still, easily spit out, 1 to 2,000 lines of code, and it's not necessarily going to be the best code, right? It's definitely going to have like, dead ends where, code is not being called anywhere, or just like very weird design decisions in like spaghetti code and just having all these, issues with the code base. But you can get it to compile and you can get it to run. And if you're just using it for like maybe, a couple months, maybe 3, 4 months, and just, forgetting about it, then it'll probably be good enough, right? But the reason why I wanted to make this channel and the reason why I wanted to essentially get more people on board with my vision was, over the years, I haven't really spent a lot of time in the AI industry compared to other people. I've really only spent about 2 to 3 years, but I've seen enough to where I'm kind of seeing this cycle of, people pushing out a model, whether it's the HRM, that's a hierarchical reasoning model, or maybe it's the recursive language model or something else. And then every single time I'm seeing this pattern of, a new model is developed, the people say, oh my God, this is the key to AGI and all this kind of stuff comes out. And then after a couple weeks, people are like, actually, no, that's not quite, it's not quite what's going on here, right? And just kind of seeing this, happen over and over and over again, I basically want to be able to sort of make some progress to that, make some progress towards, building an AGI system, but from the perspective of like an engineering saying, okay, what is a practical way of doing something at the smallest possible level and getting clarity on what comes after LLMs, right? Because even with all the improvements of LLMs, even with all of the advancements, the fact that you can output, a couple thousand lines of code and is actually coherent and workable and it compiles and it runs, there are still major issues with it. Even outside of hallucinations, just certain limitations inherent to LLMs that kind of shows that it will be a component of a AGI system. Likely it will be because, especially because of the attention mechanism and how um, basically important that is. But again, I just want to be able to actually sit down and test out all these different frameworks, all these different papers, and figure out a way of, again, finding what is the next step after LLMs, right? So one of the things that LLMs have been really good at, even, all the way, back in the early days, like 2023, 2022, they were always good at getting information, getting access to information. So like, let's say, for example, you're sitting down and you want to learn about biology. You've never done anything with biology, you've never done any sort of experiments with that. And basically, you can, come up with like a vague concept of what you want, like 1 to 2 sentences. You can put it into an LLM and it will show you a list of relevant papers that you can go through on your own and find out what you want to know and actually, start running experiments in that field or whatever field that you want. The main value that I've gotten out of LLMs consistently, again, is through that, getting access to papers from other industries that I don't really have experience in. Now I can actually run experiments and actually validate ideas um, using these LLMs as well, again, to just get access to information, get access to tutorials that'll teach me, and then ultimately I will go and do the experiments myself. Now, I have about 120 to 130 papers that I've just collected over like the past year and a half, and these are ranges from everything from like biology to machine learning to AI, spiking neural networks, like energy-based model hybrids. And there was a paper that came out, I think it was about October, the first version of the paper came out. And basically, one of the main benefits of this is that it reduces the cost to actually train models by like 50 to 100x, right? So whether that's LLMs, whether that's a variation of autoencoder, whether that's, some hybrid, crazy, hybrid that most people don't really think about, again, you now have the ability to actually, train these models, test them out without actually having to pay that much money, right? Because before this paper came out, I was following a YouTuber, and he would usually put out like a video like every couple of days about some new paper he came across, about some new, crazy, model that not really a whole lot of people really know about. And the consistent theme with all of these different papers and all these different models is the fact that it costs a lot of money to train them and to test them out. So I know, for example, about 4 to 5 months ago, he mentioned a new hybrid model that came out, and it costs roughly about the entire experimentation chain from start to finish about $20,000, right? And again, if we can just extrapolate that out, you have all these other different model types, right? It can cost, way more than that, 60,000, 120,000, so on and so forth. They can really get out of control. And, most people don't really have, 20, $30,000 just laying around to test out random models on the hope that potentially it'll lead to something that will be, the next step after LLMs, right? But again, with this new paper that came out, it now makes it a lot more realistic to actually start testing these models out, start working with them, and essentially figuring out what that next step looks like. So that's basically what I want to do with this channel, taking, some of the frameworks that I've collected over the past year and a half, and then using this new framework that came out about October last year, and that had a update in February, using that to actually test out these new model types, these new frameworks, and figuring out what that next step looks like. So if that's something you're interested in, stick around, and I'm going to be releasing a couple of videos on spiking neural networks, some hybrids with energy-based models, and basically testing that out and seeing how far I can take that.